Yeah, we were the first to do it. So, so he's interviewing me, right?
Okay.
And like you said, I know how to speak the English language.
No doubt.
So he was already offended because it was words and it wasn't.
Soul Train was the hottest ticket in town for black artists looking to make their mark. But just because you were a superstar didn't mean you were welcome. Don Cornelius ran his show like a well-oiled machine, and if you didn't fit the Soul Train mold, you were out. Some artists were too wild, too unpredictable, or just didn't play by Don's rules. And that meant they got the boot. From Rick James's no-filter attitude.
Wait, by the way, has anybody ever seen Don Cornelius dance? He's got his own dance. It's called The Cool. You just stand there.
To rap groups that had Don side-eyeing the entire genre. Some of music's biggest names like Prince might have found themselves unofficially blacklisted. So, who made Don's Do Not Invite list? Let's get into it. Rick James and Don Cornelius had the kind of interviews that felt less like a casual chat and more like a high-stakes verbal duel, where every smile hid a sharp edge. On the surface, it was all respect and good humor, compliments, laughter, the usual act. But underneath, the tension was thick, like they were both waiting for the other to slip up. Rick wasn't new to Soul Train. He had history with the show, and Don made sure to remind him of it. In one interview, he started warm. Rick played along, almost sentimental, saying something about how Soul Train was, where he learned to dance. Don basically said, that wasn't particularly a good thing. That one landed funny. But he wasn't about to let Don have the last word. Instead, he flipped it, cracking jokes about Don's legendary ability to stand completely still and call it a dance move. They called it banter, but the audience could tell it wasn't just fun and games.
Wait, by the way, has anybody ever seen Don Cornelius dance? He's got his own dance. It's called The Cool. You just stand there.
In another interview, Rick, never one to miss a moment, made sure his look got some attention. The outfit, the attitude, it was all part of the package. Don tried to keep up, but this was Rick's stage. But Rick ran through a list of his band members like he was shouting out an exclusive club, making sure everyone knew who was rolling with him. Everything's low-key chaotic with Rick, and somewhere in all that chaos, Don looked like he was regretting ever asking Rick to explain anything.
If you have one shoe missing, just put it on another shoe. It's called Fun Wave.
Then there's that interview, the one where Don thought he'd get the last word. That's where it got really interesting. Rick was flexing about his record-breaking shows, listing stadium numbers like a rock star tallying conquests. Don congratulated him, but with that tone, the kind that sounded friendly but had just enough doubt in it to sting. Rick caught it immediately. He reminded Don that the last time he was on the show, Don wasn't so sure about his success, and Don, he actually admitted it. Straight up told Rick he had doubted him, but there he was, sitting across from the man who proved him wrong. Rick took the win with a smirk, while Don tried to brush it off.
For you.
Yes, Don.
Couldn't happen to a better person.
Hey, well, that's what I said last time I was on your show, and you disagreed with me.
Well, I've been wrong before, brother. You know, I know I said you would never be nothing.
What looked like playful back and forth on camera, behind the scenes, it was a whole different story. They clashed hard. Rick wasn't the kind of artist to play it safe, and Don wasn't the kind of host to let chaos run unchecked. From the jump, Rick's energy was overwhelming. The audience ate it up, but Don had questions. His flashy look, his larger-than-life presence, his refusal to tone it down. It was clear Don saw Rick as unpredictable, and Rick saw Don as out of touch.
Now I gotta eat my words,
I said the same thing about you, and I was true.
Things really started shifting when Don put Rick on the spot about his, let's call it, colorful reputation. And Rick, never one to back down, leaned into it, basically saying that unpredictability was what made him a star. The tension, you could feel it through the screen. What used to feel like a performance started started looking personal. Then came the moment that sealed the deal. Rick made it known that he thought Soul Train was getting stale, that it wasn't keeping up, that it needed to make space for artists like him who were shaking things up. That comment didn't just get back to Don, it stuck. And let's just say, he wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for Rick after that. Slowly but surely, Rick was edged out, his appearances becoming fewer and fewer until they stopped altogether. And honestly, it made sense. Rick James wasn't built for playing nice, and Soul Train wasn't built to handle someone like him long term. He had already left his mark, on the stage, on the show, on Don himself. But keeping him around, that was a whole different conversation. Like I said earlier, Rick was, let's call it, outspoken. Some would call him chaotic. Rick was not one to stay quiet, and when MTV kept ignoring his Super Freak video, he let them have it. He called them out for shutting out black artists. And while the network eventually changed its tune, they put their energy into hyping up Michael Jackson and Prince instead of giving Rick his moment. That bridge burned.
That girl is pretty kinky. Girl's a super freak. I really love to shake.
And that wasn't the only one. Things with his record label, Motown, got messy too. His demands were getting bigger, his behavior more unpredictable, and the final straw, a meeting with the label's president that turned into a full-blown spectacle. Let's just say, it involved a confrontation and an impromptu party favor situation. Motown saw where this was heading and quietly started shifting their focus to other artists. Hello, Lionel Richie. Between that and his growing list of problems, the industry started pulling away. Less airplay, fewer opportunities, and a lot of doors that once swung open were suddenly locked shut.
And I'm talking about albums that sold millions of copies. Every album we did, we never failed to have an ounce or two sitting right there on the console.
Really?
A big bag of Quaaludes, okay? Cristal champagne and Jack Black bourbon, and all at our beck and command, right?
See, Rick James was always a walking contradiction, charismatic, talented, and undeniably reckless. By the 80s, he had earned his title as the King of Funk, turning out slick R&B hits while burning through money and relationships just as fast. But by the early 90s, the headlines weren't about his music anymore.
Rick was my brother too. We hung out all the time, and so one of the almost a prerequisite of being with Rick was to be high, so we began high and
Back in 1979, long before his legal troubles became front-page news, a 15-year-old girl living in a New York youth detention center claimed James had visited the facility. She didn't know who he was, but the other girls were excited. Almost immediately, she said he made her uncomfortable with inappropriate comments. Later that day, as she lay in her room reading, James allegedly came in, pinned her down. She said he warned her to stay quiet, threatening, "Shut up and quit moving or I'll cut you." The alleged attack would haunt her for decades, and in 2020, she filed a lawsuit against his estate, seeking damages for the trauma she claimed had followed her ever since. By the early 90s, James's career had been through its own roller coaster. He'd found success in the late 70s with songs like You and I and Mary Jane, but his newfound fame only fueled his addiction. By the end of the decade, stronger grip on him than the industry did. He got a brief boost in 1990 when MC Hammer's You Can't Touch. This turned Super Freak into a crossover rap hit, earning James his first Grammy. But any goodwill he had left was obliterated when, in August 1991, he and his girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, were arrested for a crime straight out of a horror movie. A 24-year-old woman named Frances Alley accused James and Hijazi of holding her captive in his Hollywood Hills mansion for 2 days. She said they burned her legs and stomach with a crack pipe. As if that wasn't bad enough, while out on bail for that case, James allegedly assaulted another woman, a music executive named Mary Sauger. She claimed James and Hijazi held her hostage for 20 hours in a West Hollywood hotel room and beat her. When the trial finally happened in 1993, it was a spectacle. James sobbed on the stand and even asked the judge for a weekend release so he could marry Hijazi, a request that was quickly denied. The court didn't buy his performance. He was convicted on charges of assault, false imprisonment, and drug offenses. The torture charge was dropped, but it didn't matter. He was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months behind bars. Hijazi took a plea deal and served 15 months.
Everybody know I'm not no punk. Number one, I mean, the whole bottom line is I had a blanket of love in prison because I'm real. I mean, if I had walked in prison with some kind of uppity attitude, if I had walked in prison thinking that I was this or I was that.
Prison, James later claimed, saved his life. If he hadn't been locked up, he believed he would have overdosed. While serving time at Folsom State Prison, he wrote over 300 songs. He was released in 1996 after serving just over 2 years, and by 1997, he finally got his wish. He married Hijazi 6 years after their infamous arrest, and 5 years after their son, Tasman, was born. Even after prison, trouble still seemed to follow him. In 2002, he was investigated for allegedly sexually assaulting a woman at his home. 2 years later, he was dead. Then, in 2020, the past came back to haunt his name once again when the woman from 1979 stepped forward with her lawsuit. Decades later, Rick James remained as controversial in death as he was in life. A legend, a cautionary tale, and a man who burned bright and crashed hard. Okay, back to other artists. Don Cornelius didn't want to have on Soul Train, so Don also had issues with some Soul Train performers. Back in the day, there was always a little tension brewing. The show had a way of doing things that didn't always sit right with artists or their labels. One major sticking point? The whole pretend you're singing policy. To keep things running smooth and save money, the show made artists lip sync, which wasn't exactly a fan favorite among musicians who thrived on live energy. Some, like James Brown, Barry White, Prince, and Aretha Franklin, weren't about to fake it for the cameras, which definitely made things tricky behind the scenes.
Oh my God, don't know why.
As the show blew up, so did its influence. What started as a go-to spot for R&B, soul, and funk slowly started letting in more pop acts. This didn't go over well with everyone, especially labels repping traditional soul artists who felt like they were getting pushed to the side. And then there was the moment when white rock artists started showing up. Think Elton John, Gino Vanelli, David Bowie. Their songs were already getting play on black radio, so it wasn't completely random, but still, it ruffled a few feathers. Next is Sugar Hill.
God, this is amazing.
We were the first to do it, so so he's interviewing me, right?
Okay.
And like you said, I know how to speak the English language.
No doubt.
So he was already offended because it was words and it wasn't.
When rap acts first hit the Soul Train stage, Cornelius wasn't exactly sold. He wasn't shy about questioning if this whole rap thing was actually gonna last. Spoiler alert, it did. And as hip-hop kept evolving, so did the divide between what Soul Train was built on and where the culture was headed. Sugar Hill artists felt like Don was actively holding the genre back by not featuring it on his show. One of the most infamous moments came when Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five performed on Soul Train. Flash was one of the biggest names in hip-hop at the time. After their performance, Don did one of his classic awkward interviews, where he pretty much mocked the whole concept of rapping and DJing. He couldn't wrap his head around what Flash was doing with the turntables, and he low-key dismissed the whole performance. The Furious Five looked uncomfortable, and hip-hop fans never forgot it. Next, Death Row Records.
Everybody in the house, come on, it's like this and like that and like this and
It was clear that Don saw hip-hop as just a phase, something that would fizzle out. Then came gangsta rap, flipping the industry on its head with unfiltered street stories and anthems that made record labels nervous. Death Row's biggest names, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac, were running the game, but Soul Train wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. Cornelius, with his deep love for classic R&B, wasn't all that eager to embrace the shift. Compared to platforms like Yo MTV Raps or BET, Soul Train just wasn't the go-to for hardcore rap, which had people wondering if Cornelius was keeping up or just sticking to his roots. Next, Curtis Blow.
But these are the breaks. Break it up, break it up, break it up, break down.
Even as rap kept getting bigger, Soul Train still wasn't giving it the shine it deserved. That was pretty clear when Curtis Blow showed up on Soul Train. Looking back, Curtis admitted the whole thing stung. Cornelius just wasn't feeling it. Yeah, Curtis came through with the breaks, but the Soul Train crowd wasn't exactly moving like they usually did. The dancers, used to those smooth disco and funk beats, looked a little lost trying to keep up with this whole new thing. And Cornelius, he just didn't see the appeal of rap. Even with all that hesitation, that performance cracked open a door. Hip-hop was getting national exposure, and whether Cornelius liked it or not, it wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't just about music. It was a generational clash. Don came from an era where live instrumentation, choreographed performances, and smooth vocals were the gold standard. Hip-hop, with its DJ-driven beats and spoken word delivery, felt like a completely different world. He didn't hate it, but he definitely didn't embrace it. Next, Rosie Perez. Rosie Perez. Yeah, that Rosie Perez got her start as a dancer on Soul Train in the early 80s, but her time there was anything but smooth. She was young, hungry, and danced like nobody's business. But Don Cornelius, he was not feeling her energy. Rosie came in with a whole new style. Sharp, aggressive, fast moves that leaned more into hip-hop. That did not fit Don's clean, cool, and polished aesthetic. He wanted dancers to groove in a more traditional way. But Rosie, she was straight up freestyling and bringing in East Coast b-boy energy. That caused friction. Word on the street is, Don reportedly pulled her aside multiple times, telling her she was dancing too wild and needed to tone it down. But Rosie wasn't the type to tone down anything, and one day, things boiled over. She went off, telling Don that Soul Train dancers were being exploited and weren't even getting paid for their work. This was a huge deal because Soul Train dancers were a major part of the show's appeal, but they were doing it for free just for exposure. Don did not like being challenged, and after that argument, Rosie quit the show on the spot. Leaving Soul Train turned out to be the best thing for her. She went on to become a huge choreographer in the music industry, working with Janet Jackson, Bobby Brown, and others. Later, she transitioned into acting. White Men Can't Jump, Do the Right Thing, proving that walking away from Soul Train didn't hurt her one bit. Don, on the other hand, never publicly addressed the Rosie Perez fallout, but it was clear that he had a love-hate relationship with the dancers who became stars in their own right. He wanted Soul Train to be the brand, not the individual dancers. Next, Prince.
He is formerly known the world over as Prince, but now he just goes by an unpronounceable symbol. Still, he remains one of the greatest artists of our time.
Prince didn't pop up on Soul Train all that often, but when he did, people paid attention. One of the rare times he showed up, he performed The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, and then sat down for an interview that was, let's just say, not the smoothest conversation. Cornelius tried to get him talking, but Prince, being Prince, kept things short and mysterious, making for a slightly awkward back and forth. It was a classic case of two completely different energies. Cornelius, the polished host, and Prince, the enigmatic artist who always played by his own rules. Prince wasn't the type to be boxed in. His music jumped between genres, breaking all the so-called rules, while Soul Train had a more structured lane, mainly sticking to soul, R&B, and funk. That contrast might have had something to do with why he didn't stop by more often. People have gone back and forth on why Prince kept his distance. Some think he wanted to keep his audience as wide as possible and didn't want to be locked into one specific space. Others figure Cornelius just wasn't really into Prince's more out-of-the-box approach. Either way, Soul Train and Prince were both legends, just on different wavelengths. Next, Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston getting booed at the Soul Train Awards? Yeah, that actually happened. She was on top of the world, breaking records, selling millions, and still, some people in the crowd weren't feeling her. Why? They thought her music was too pop, too mainstream, not Black Enough. Soul Train was all about celebrating black artists, and some folks didn't think she fit. It wasn't like she wasn't making R&B, she was, but her songs were blowing up in a way that made white audiences latch on, and people started side-eyeing that. Some blamed her label, saying they were pushing her toward pop stardom instead of sticking to R&B. And when she lost a couple of awards that night, some in the crowd let her know they weren't on board. Even worse, someone threw out a comment about her being too white. That hit hard. She didn't just brush it off, she felt it. But she wasn't about to let a few boos shake her. She kept doing her thing, making music, proving herself over and over again. People eventually came around, realizing she wasn't just a pop act, she was in a league of her own. Other artists who crossed over, like Michael and Janet, didn't get the same pushback. Maybe it was the way Whitney was marketed. Maybe it was just different expectations for women in the industry. Whatever the reason, she wasn't about to let people put her in a box. She grew up listening to the same R&B legends as everybody else. She knew exactly where she came from, and she wasn't going to apologize for her success. Years later, she was back at Soul Train, getting honored as one of the best to ever do it. Funny how that works. That night of booze didn't define her. Her voice did. And then there was Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin walking onto that Soul Train stage wasn't just another TV appearance. It was her reminding everybody she was the moment. She had already spent years running the game. But music was shifting, and she wasn't about to sit on the sidelines. This was during her Sparkle era, working with Curtis Mayfield and dropping Something He Can Feel. Slow, smooth, and straight-up magnetic. Perfect for a show that wasn't just about music, but about setting the tone for black culture on TV, when most networks barely cared. And because Aretha didn't do things like everyone else, she showed up and actually sang live. Most artists on the show just mouthed along, but holding back wasn't in her DNA. She let it all out. Raw, unfiltered, and straight from the soul. She wasn't a regular on Soul Train either. The show usually spotlighted up-and-coming artists. So, having her there, that was a big deal. It was proof that this wasn't just a space for the next generation. It was the place for black music, period. Aretha had been unstoppable since linking up with Atlantic Records and hitting the studio in Muscle Shoals. That's where she dropped I Never Loved a Man, The Way I Love You, and Never Looked Back. Respect, Think, Chain of Fools, hit after hit, proving nobody could touch her. But the industry was changing. Funk and disco were taking over. New artists were stepping in, and even legends had to figure out how to move with the times. That Soul Train moment, it wasn't just a performance. It was her stamping her influence on what came next. No matter where music went, there would only ever be one Aretha Franklin.